The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn as Katie Rodriguez pushed through the double doors of Seattle General's ICU at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. 3 months. That's how long she'd been rebuilding a life where nobody asked questions about the way her left shoulder ached in the rain or why her hands moved through medical procedures with the precision of someone trained in battlefields instead of hospitals. The night shift suited her: fewer eyes, fewer questions, fewer moments where someone might notice the way she favored her left side or how her jaw clenched at the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. The ICU smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, that peculiar combination of industrial cleanliness and human suffering that never quite mixed right. Her sneakers squeaked against the tile as she moved through the corridor, checking the assignment board. 12 patients tonight. Routine cases, mostly. Post-operative recoveries. An elderly woman with pneumonia whose daughter had called 4 times that day. A young man with a shattered pelvis from a motorcycle accident. And in room for 12, a name that would have meant nothing to anyone else. Captain Marcus Webb. 2 years comatose. The chart said IED blast in Ramadi. The chart said no improvement, minimal brain activity, family maintaining hope against probability. The chart said he was a decorated Navy officer whose body kept breathing on machines while his mind lived somewhere else entirely. Katie had seen 1,000 charts like this one in her previous life, in field hospitals, in transport helicopters, in the desperate hours after convoy ambushes. She knew what 2 years of unconsciousness meant. She knew what those odds looked like. She wasn't supposed to know any of this yet. But Katie had learned long ago that charts told stories if you knew how to read them. She approached room for 12 slowly, the way she always moved now, not the way a major moved through a forward operating base, but the way a civilian nurse moved through a hospital. Tentative. Unobtrusive. Forgettable. The kind of person people looked through instead of at. The room was dark except for the pale glow of the monitor and the 4 pumps. Captain Webb lay in the adjustable bed, sheets pulled up to his chest, his face peaceful in the way comatose patients' faces never actually were. There was something ancient about unconsciousness, a kind of waiting that had nothing to do with hope. His mother sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed, her hand resting on her son's arm. His father stood at the window, shoulders curved inward, looking out at San Diego's nighttime sprawl as if he might find answers in the streetlights. Katie moved through the room with practiced silence, checking the ventilator settings, the heart monitor, the 4 lines. Her hands were steady as she worked. They always were. Her hands had held enough lives together under fire that a sleeping patient felt like mercy. And then she saw it. The jacket hung on the back of the closet door, old and faded, the kind of thing someone keeps for reasons that matter more than fabric and stitching. Katie moved closer, her movements automatic, professional. She reached for the jacket as if checking its placement, as if anyone cared about how neat a closet was in a hospital room where time had stopped 2 years ago. Inside the jacket lining, sewn with what looked like field repair stitches, maybe dental floss, maybe actual thread, it was hard to tell in the darkness, was a patch. Faded. Worn. The colors barely distinguishable anymore, desert tan and black, with the number 5 and the words 1st Battalion clearly visible. 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. Katie's hands stopped moving. 20 years collapsed into the space of a single breath. A convoy rolling through Ramadi in the furnace heat of a summer morning. An IED detonation like thunder that rearranged the air itself. The Humvee burning, the windshield melting, and there a small face pressed against the rear window. A boy, maybe 9 years old, maybe younger, traveling with his father's unit the way military kids sometimes did, embedded in the machine of overseas deployment. She remembered the heat of the flames. She remembered her hands finding purchase on the door frame. She remembered the boy's weight as she'd pulled him free, his small hands gripping her flak jacket as if she were the last solid thing in a world turned to fire. She'd carried him to the aid station. She'd handed him to a corpsman. She'd never known what happened to him after that. Until now. The trembling started in her hands, not fear, not anymore, but the electrical current of recognition firing through her nervous system like a command she couldn't ignore. She steadied herself against the closet door, forced her breathing to remain even and shallow. Captain Marcus Webb. Of course. The boy would be 31 now, would be an officer, would have served and sacrificed in ways she could only imagine from the safety of her new life, pushing medications and checking monitors. He was in room for 12. He'd been here for 2 years. He was the reason she'd taken this shift, though she hadn't known why at the time. "Can I help you?" Katie turned. The mother was watching her with the careful intensity of someone who'd spent 2 years learning to read the smallest changes in her son's condition. Katie's jaw clenched, released. She tucked the jacket carefully back into place, made sure the patch was still secure, and offered the kind of smile that civilians offered civilians: small, professional, forgettable. "Just checking on his things," Katie said. "Making sure everything's in order." The mother nodded slowly, then turned back to her son, settling back into the vinyl chair with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd stopped sleeping in beds and started sleeping in hospital furniture. The father remained at the window, a silhouette against the city lights, a man holding a vigil that might never end. Katie left the room and moved through the corridor like a ghost. Her shift continued. Medications at midnight. Vitals at 1. The rhythmic work of keeping machines running and patients breathing. But her mind was somewhere else entirely, running tactical patterns, asking questions that had no answers yet. Why hadn't the file mentioned this? Why hadn't someone flagged the coincidence? Why was she the only person in this hospital who understood what that patch meant? The supply room was quieter than the main floor. Dimmer. Just the low hum of the climate control keeping the medications at proper temperature, and the occasional soft click of the automated refrigeration units. Katie pulled the controlled substance log at 2 in the morning, moving the way she'd learned to move in military hospitals, efficient, methodical, leaving no sign of her presence except the work itself. Something was wrong with Captain Webb's medication records. She could see it immediately, the way certain entries didn't match the pharmacy dispensary logs, the way pain medications were recorded but the quantities didn't align with what the pharmaceutical record showed. Her finger traced the discrepancies, her eyes narrowing. Fentanyl patches. Morphine 4. Dilaudid. The same medications, over and over, in quantities that suggested a patient receiving palliative care or management of chronic pain. A comatose patient who couldn't request pain medication. A patient whose family probably didn't question dosages or frequency. A patient whose medical needs were invisible to everyone except the attending physician. A ghost in the system. Katie was cross-referencing the dispensary logs against the medication administration records when the door behind her opened. The overhead light flickered on with a harsh white silence. Dr. Caldwell stood in the doorway, his white coat pristine at 2 in the morning, his expression shifting through surprise into something else. Something colder. Something calculated. He looked at the logs in her hands. He looked at the supply room around her. He looked at her face, and Katie saw the exact moment his mind assembled the pieces. She didn't look away. She didn't explain. She didn't do what a civilian would do, which was to offer some kind of justification or apology for being in the supply room at an hour when supply room inventory wasn't generally on a nurse's schedule. Instead, Katie Rodriguez closed the medication log slowly and held his gaze with the kind of steady composure that had carried her through ambushes and evacuations and the worst moments human bodies could endure. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Caldwell smiled, a thin, dangerous thing that revealed nothing but intent. "That's interesting," he said softly. "Very interesting indeed." And Katie understood, with the clarity of someone trained to assess threats, that everything had changed. The morning light filtered through Captain Webb's window in pale strips when Dr. Caldwell entered room for 12. Katie was checking vitals, her fingers steady on the blood pressure cuff, her eyes tracking the numbers with the precision of someone who'd read monitors under mortar fire. Webb's mother sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed, her weathered hands folded in her lap. His father, Colonel retired, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, stood at the window with the posture of a man who'd never learned how to fully relax. Caldwell's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. "Nurse Rodriguez." We need to discuss your unauthorized chart access. Not a question. A pronouncement. Loud enough that a family peering through the doorway of room for 10 paused mid-step. Are you aware that reviewing controlled substance logs is outside your scope of practice? Katie removed the blood pressure cuff with deliberate care. One measured breath. She turned to face him, her expression flat as still water. I was ensuring medication reconciliation, doctor. Her voice came out soft, measured, the words of someone trained to de-escalate. Not the voice she used to own. Perhaps at whatever small facility trained you, standards were different. Caldwell stepped closer, his chest puffed slightly forward. The posture of a man accustomed to being the largest presence in any room. Here at Seattle General, we follow protocols. Strict protocols. Or did they not cover that in your accelerated nursing program? The mother's jaw tightened. The father's hand moved to the bed rail, his knuckles whitening slightly. Katie saw them being pulled into this, saw the calculation in Caldwell's choice to humiliate her here, in front of witnesses who would remember the scene forever. My training was quite thorough, Dr. Caldwell. She said it evenly, meeting his eyes for exactly 1 second before looking back to her chart. She wiped a single tear that escaped with the back of her hand, the gesture practiced, controlled, performed for his benefit. Let him think he'd broken something. Let him believe he'd won. He smiled. The smile of a predator who'd just tasted blood in the water. Then act like it, nurse night shift. Or next time we'll be discussing your employment termination instead of your lapses in judgment. He left. The sound of his shoes clicking against the linoleum faded down the hallway. Webb's mother reached out and touched Katie's arm, a gesture of solidarity that felt like a knife through her ribs. You were just helping him, the mother whispered. Anyone with eyes could see that. Katie nodded, unable to speak. She finished checking the remaining vitals and left the room before the weight of their kindness crushed something essential inside her. By afternoon, the break room had become a minefield. Katie pushed open the door with her shoulder, her lunch bag in one hand, and found 4 nurses already seated at the table nearest the window. They were discussing the new cardiac monitors, their voices animated, their body language loose and easy. The moment they saw her, the conversation died like a radio losing signal. One nurse, Teresa, who'd brought Katie coffee on her first night shift, gathered her yogurt cup. Then Marcus picked up his sandwich. Then Jennifer scraped her chair back from the table. They left in sequence, choreographed silence, their shoes making soft sounds against the linoleum. They didn't look at her. They simply left, the message precise, we can't afford to be near you. Katie sat at the now empty table. The vending machine hummed its mechanical drone beside her. She opened her lunch, a sandwich she'd made at 5 in the morning, back when she still believed in tomorrow, and ate in the silence of someone who'd learned, a long time ago, to be comfortable with solitude. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed with the sound of dying electricity. She counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. By 60, she stopped counting and simply chewed. By evening, she was checking the unit assignment board in the hallway when she saw it. Her name, handwritten in red marker, the letters sharp and aggressive, K. Rodriguez, written warning, overstepping scope of practice, unauthorized documentation access. Beneath it, a formal incident report printed and laminated, already posted for the entire staff to see. The board was mounted directly across from the nursing station. Every nurse, every tech, every resident would pass it a dozen times a shift. Every family member would read it. The permanence of it was the point. Effective immediately, a new memo stated below, N. Rodriguez is restricted from patient care in ICU Ward 7. Any violation will result in immediate disciplinary action up to and including termination. She stood there, reading her own professional destruction spelled out in red ink. Around her, nurses whispered. A resident she'd helped through a difficult intubation 2 weeks ago looked at the board, then at Katie, then deliberately looked away. In that moment, Katie understood, she was contagion. From his office window on the far side of the nursing station, Dr. Caldwell watched her read the warning. His body was turned slightly away, as if he weren't intentionally observing her, but his eyes tracked her movements with the precision of a hunter calculating distance and wind. When he saw her notice him, he smiled. A smile that suggested he'd been waiting for her to look. Katie turned from the board. She walked directly to his office door. She didn't knock. She simply opened it and stepped inside, and when he started to speak, she raised one hand, a gesture so fluid and commanding that his mouth closed automatically. She moved to his window, the one overlooking the entire unit, the one that gave him a perfect vantage point to watch every nurse move through his domain. She looked through that glass directly at him, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped half an octave. The accent of someone trained to be heard over rotors and wind and chaos. "My scope is broader than you know, Doctor." For exactly 3 seconds, nothing moved. Caldwell's expression flickered, surprise, then calculation, then something close to concern, before he recovered it with a sneer. "Threats now, Nurse Rodriguez? That's a new low. I'll be adding that to your file." But Katie was already turning, already walking out of his office. She didn't need him to understand. Not yet. Understanding would come later, when the right people arrived. When the pieces she'd been quietly collecting fell into place. When he realized he'd made the mistake of cornering someone who'd spent 20 years learning how to fight people far more dangerous than him. The next 2 weeks unfolded like a punishment meticulously designed. Katie arrived for her Monday shift and checked the assignment board to find herself scheduled for the surgical recovery wing. No explanation. No conversation. Just a reassignment that removed her from Captain Webb's floor entirely. On Wednesday, she came in to discover she'd been moved to pediatrics. Thursday brought another change. Now she was floating between emergency department and trauma, her schedule fragmented, her continuity of care shattered. She began documenting everything in a personal notebook, the pages dense with dates and times and medication orders that didn't add up. She noted which nurses were working which shifts when Caldwell made his orders for controlled substance pools. She tracked the patients, 3 long-term coma cases, 1 persistent vegetative state, all receiving elevated doses of morphine and fentanyl that bore no clinical justification, all charted under rush notes that made no medical sense. Pain was information. This information told a story of systematic theft, of a doctor using the most vulnerable patients as phantoms in his supply chain. She visited Captain Webb during her breaks, reading his chart when assigned nurses stepped out for shift change. His mother was always there, her presence like a worn stone at the foot of the bed. His father maintained his vigil with the calm patience of a Marine, sitting in a chair that looked designed for discomfort, never complaining, never leaving. On Friday, Katie mentioned she'd done some years in service. The father had simply nodded, a slight acknowledgement of one military member recognizing another, and he hadn't pressed for details. Veterans understood, the stories you carried were yours to share or keep. That same Friday afternoon, Caldwell's office door opened and a woman emerged, the chief nursing officer, her badge reading Patricia Hayes, RN MSN. She found Katie at the medication station. "Dr. Caldwell would like to see you. Now." The office was cold. Caldwell sat behind his desk with Hayes beside him, the positioning deliberate, the message clear. This was institutional, not personal. Though they both knew better. "We're concerned about your fixation on Captain Webb," Caldwell began, his voice pitched low and clinical. "You've been observed in his room on multiple occasions when not assigned to his care. This pattern of behavior is troubling. Obsessive, even." Katie's left shoulder ached. Phantom pain from shrapnel that had torn through muscle and sinew in Fallujah, from the same blast that had taken David. She'd learned to read that ache as a warning signal, the way it spiked when danger was present. It was spiking now. "I'm ensuring continuity of care for a patient who..." "You're being formally restricted from Captain Webb's room effective immediately," Hayes interrupted, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone reading from a prepared script. "Any violation will result in immediate termination. This is not negotiable." Caldwell's expression was triumph painted over with the mask of professional concern. He already knew she'd push back. He was already prepared to fire her. Katie stood. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply collected the formal restriction notice Hayes extended across the desk and walked out of the office. Behind her, she heard Caldwell's voice, "Make sure she knows we'll be monitoring the situation closely." Very closely indeed. That night, Katie drove to the cemetery in the rain. The sky had opened up around 5 o'clock, and the drops fell like they had weight and intention. She parked near the section marked Veterans Rest and walked through the wet grass to a grave marked with a simple stone, "David Michael Rodriguez, beloved husband, devoted soldier." She knelt in the mud. The rain soaked through her jeans, cold against her skin, real and present. She pressed her forehead against the marble, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she let herself speak the words that had been building pressure behind her ribs. "I found him, David. I found our little Marcus." Her voice came out raw, unfiltered, the voice she only used in the dark. "The boy from Ramadi. The one we carried out of that burning Humvee. He's here. He's been here the whole time, and I didn't even know until 3 months ago." The rain hammered down harder, thundering against the headstones like applause from a crowd that didn't exist. "I'm failing him just like I failed you." The words came out broken, the confession of someone running out of time and options. "They know I'm watching. They know I found the pattern. And I can't do anything about it because I promised myself I'd stay invisible. I promised you I'd just be a nurse, just be normal, just be someone who doesn't remember how to fight." She pressed her palm flat against the stone. The marble was slick with rain, cold as bone. "I don't know if I remember anymore, David. I don't know if I can be what he needs. I don't know if I'm even allowed to be." The rain continued to fall. Katie remained there, kneeling in the mud, until the cold drove her back to her feet. Then she walked back to her car, water running down her face and neck, and drove to the hospital for her night shift, carrying the weight of every promise she'd made and every promise she'd already broken. Katie pushed through the hospital's employee entrance at 11:53 p.m. Monday night, her scrubs still damp from the rain. The parking lot had been empty. The drive from the cemetery had taken 43 minutes, and every minute of it she'd held her breath, waiting for her phone to ring with news that she'd already missed something critical in Webb's room. It hadn't rung. That made it worse. The night shift supervisor, Janet, stood at the main desk sorting assignments into color-coded folders. Her eyes found Katie's face, then quickly looked away. That hesitation was new. That was the moment Katie understood the cascade had begun. "You're on the surgical wing tonight," Janet said, not meeting her gaze. "Sub-assignments. Pre-op screening, post-op monitoring." Dr. Caldwell put in a request for coverage adjustments. Janet's voice had that careful neutrality of someone reading a script someone else had written. Katie stood motionless for exactly 3 seconds. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in the color of old bone. "I'm on the ICU rotation. Thursdays through Sundays." "You're reassigned effective immediately. He wants you supporting the surgical teams." Janet finally looked at her, and there was apology in that look, and something worse, pity. "I don't make the decisions, Katie. I just execute them. Effective immediately." Those 2 words contained a world of deliberate precision. Caldwell wasn't firing her. Not yet. He was using the hospital's own machinery, its vast bureaucratic skeleton, to methodically dismantle her access without leaving marks. Katie nodded once and turned toward the surgical wing hallway, but not before she saw Janet wince at the motion, as if watching someone walk toward a predictable disaster was harder than delivering the blow. The surgical wing at midnight was its own separate universe. The operating theaters were dark except for instrument sterilization lights, and the recovery bay held 3 post-op patients, a 62-year-old with a newly reconstructed knee, a woman in her 50s recovering from a gallbladder removal, and an elderly man post-colectomy. Their monitors beeped their individual rhythms, and Katie fell into the work with the mechanical precision of someone who understood that work was the only language left that wouldn't betray her. She checked full lines. Drew labs. Monitored O2 saturation curves. Documented vitals in patient charts with the exact timestamps and measurements that Janet had taught her during her first week at Seattle General, back when she'd been invisible, back when she'd been safe. Wednesday came with another reassignment notice. This one arrived in her mailbox at the start of shift. Katie opened the sealed envelope with surgical gloves still on, and the word seemed to swim across the paper, effective 2,400 hours 12/18, nursing assignments adjusted to optimize unit coverage per clinical administrator directive. 3 days of rotating assignments. Monday surgical wing. Tuesday pediatrics. Wednesday emergency medicine triage. Every department separated by physical distance and logistical walls. The ICU was 6 floors up. Captain Webb was 6 floors up. And every reshuffling Caldwell implemented put another corridor, another set of locked doors, another boundary between Katie and the room where the boy was sleeping. This wasn't incompetence. This was choreography. By Thursday morning, the standing order arrived officially. Katie found it posted on the break room bulletin board next to the shift announcements and the monthly safety reminders. Her eyes moved across the language, clinical and devastating. Per administrative directive and scope of practice guidelines, nursing staff reassignments effective the 20th of December, 2024. RN Katie Rodriguez, Unit, General Surgical Services, restricted from direct patient care in ICU unit for pending documentation review. Scope restrictions: no access to critical care environments without RNBSN certification documentation. Clinical oversight: Dr. Matthew Caldwell, Chief of Medicine. She'd never mentioned being a nurse without a bachelor's degree. She'd shown her licenses. Everything had been in her file from day one: her associate's degree from Seattle Community College, her 5 years of practical nursing experience, her credentials perfectly legal, perfectly legitimate. But a standing order didn't need to be accurate. It only needed to exist. It only needed to be official enough that anyone who challenged it would look insubordinate. Katie read the notice twice. Then she took a photo of it with her phone. Then she carefully removed the paper from the bulletin board and placed it in her uniform pocket, her movement steady and deliberate. The break room was empty except for Thomas Chen, one of the night shift surgeons, who was pouring coffee from a carafe that smelled like it had been made yesterday. He glanced at her, saw what she was doing, and returned his full attention to the coffee with the intensity of a man who suddenly needed to be very interested in caffeine. The clinical director's office was on the 3rd floor. Katie had passed it 100 times. She'd never been inside. She climbed the stairs instead of using the elevator. The stairs were faster, quieter, and the hospital surveillance cameras had gaps along the back landings that everyone pretended not to notice. Personnel transfers happened in those gaps. Private conversations happened in those gaps. The administrative corridor was different. Quieter. The lights hummed a slightly different frequency, as if they'd been installed during a different era. The carpeting was a shade of grey that Katie couldn't quite categorize, not quite silver, not quite concrete. Everything felt designed to remind you that this was where decisions were made. This was where people like her didn't belong. Dr. Caldwell's office door was mahogany with a brass nameplate. Katie knocked once and waited. "Come in." His voice came from inside. Not surprised. As if he'd been expecting her. The office was what she'd imagined: tasteful leather furniture, a desk that cost more than most people's cars, a window that overlooked the cardiac unit's roof garden, 7 stories up. Caldwell sat behind the desk in a charcoal suit that probably cost $2,000. His hands were folded in front of him with the composure of someone who'd already won. "Major Rodriguez," he said, and the rank hung in the air between them like a blade he'd just been waiting to use. "Except no." He said it like he was testing a hypothesis. Like the word meant something but he hadn't yet connected it to her face. "Here to discuss the reassignments." Katie set the standing order on his desk. The paper made a soft sound as it slid across the mahogany surface. "This is based on certification requirements I don't have. I have every credential listed in my employment file." Caldwell picked up the order. "Read it. Set it down." His eyes held the flat quality of a man examining a piece of laboratory equipment. Your file lists an associate's degree. Many facilities now require bachelor's degrees for ICU placement. It's becoming standard of care. I'm simply implementing best practices. You know that's not a standard at Seattle General. It is now. He smiled. It was a smile like a shark showing teeth, all the correct anatomical components arranged in the right order but missing something fundamental that made it human. I've taken a personal interest in unit standards. Beginning immediately. Unit 4 will maintain a requirement for bachelor's level nursing education. Perfectly legal. Perfectly defensible. Katie stood motionless. She could feel the weight of her late husband's dog tags under her scrubs, the cold metal against her ribs. David would have seen exactly what she was seeing, a man using institutional power like a chess player uses tempo. Not attacking. Controlling the board. Why? She asked. The single word carried no inflection. No emotion. Just a question. Caldwell leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. Because you're dangerous. Not in the way you might think. You're dangerous because you see things. Details. Patterns. You have an uncomfortable eye for what doesn't fit. He paused. And I can't have someone like you continuing to scan the medication logs at 2 in the morning. So I've simply made sure you can't access the areas where you'd be tempted to look. It wasn't a confession. It was a demonstration. He was showing her that he understood exactly what she'd found, and that he'd been prepared for this conversation, and that he'd already restructured the entire unit to make her presence impossible. You're using hospital policy as a weapon, Katie said. I'm using hospital policy as a hospital administrator. He picked up a pen, returned his attention to his computer screen. The conversation was ending. Appointments with people like him didn't conclude with words, they concluded with dismissal. You'll complete your surgical rotations. You'll finish your shift cycle. And then we'll discuss a separation package that will be more than generous given your recent performance concerns. The performance concerns he'd invented. The humiliation he'd orchestrated. The written warning he'd distributed. The schedule chaos. The standing order. The slow, methodical dismantling of everything that gave her proximity to Captain Webb. Katie turned and walked toward the door. Major Rodriguez, Caldwell said. She stopped. Don't do anything dramatic. These things are better handled with professionalism. For everyone. She didn't turn around. She didn't answer. She simply left the office and closed the door with the exact amount of force required for it to latch properly, not a slam, which would have been rebellion, but not gentle, either. Just a door closing. Just a woman walking away from a man who'd already decided she was a problem to solve rather than a person to consider. The hallway stretched in front of her. The back stairs were to the left. The elevator bank was to the right. And 7 floors below, in a room with a faded unit patch hanging in the closet and a woman's face waiting in every corner of his memory, a man who couldn't yet open his eyes was still fighting his way back toward consciousness, still pushing against the weight of 2 years of darkness, still waiting for the person who'd promised never to leave him behind. Katie stood at the intersection of those 2 paths, the one that led to escape and the one that led deeper into the hospital's maze, and made her decision in the space of a single breath. She turned left. Toward the stairs. Toward the work she could still do, in the places where she was still allowed. Toward the patients that would come before the breaking point. Because Caldwell had made one calculation error. He'd assumed that removing her from Webb's room would stop her from helping him. He didn't understand that a major doesn't need access to a room to be useful. She only needs time, location, and information. And he'd just handed her 7 floors of distance to think about exactly how to weaponize her restrictions against him. The night shift stretched ahead. Katie pushed through the stairwell door and began to climb. The overhead page crackled at 7:51 a.m. Not a request. A command. Code Blue, ICU room for 12. Code Blue, ICU room for 12. Katie's hands froze mid-charting in the medical records room 3 floors below. Room for 12. Her room. The boy's room. The boy who wasn't supposed to be alive but was. The boy whose heart had beaten steadily for 2 years while everyone else assumed he was gone. She moved. The stairs were faster than the elevator. She knew this hospital like she knew the weight of a rifle, like she knew how to move through a building without being seen. 8 years of urban warfare in Fallujah had taught her the geometry of spaces, how to navigate using geometry and muscle memory instead of signage. Her left shoulder, the one that still ached when the weather turned cold, burned as she took the steps 2 at a time. 4th floor. The ICU corridor stretched ahead, antiseptic and fluorescent bright. The code team was already assembled outside room for 12, respiratory therapy, 2 residents, a nursing assistant. The door was open. Katie could see the monitors from 20 feet away, see the flat line tracing across the screen in thin yellow light. But she couldn't be there. The standing order was explicit. Dr. Caldwell had signed it himself. Room for 12 was restricted. Katie Rodriguez was forbidden. Protocol was protocol, and protocol was the only leverage Caldwell had left after Katie had seen what he'd done. She kept walking anyway. Dr. Caldwell stood at the head of the bed, his hands shaking as he gripped the laryngoscope. He'd already attempted intubation twice. Katie could see the trauma to the corner of the patient's mouth, the blood smeared on the scope blade he'd just dropped onto the bedside table. "Get me a size 7 tube," Caldwell barked. His voice cracked like thin ice. "No, 8. Push another round of epi. Has anyone checked the rhythm?" The resident glanced at the monitor. "Still flat line, sir." Caldwell's orders didn't make sense. The epi had been pushed 90 seconds ago. Pushing again would do nothing but waste time. The tube size was wrong for a male patient with Captain Webb's build. Caldwell was panicking. His hands were shaking because he wasn't thinking like a doctor anymore. He was thinking like a man watching his leverage disappear. Katie stepped past the nursing assistant. Shoulder-checked Caldwell out of the way with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned body mechanics in close-quarters combat. He stumbled backward, his surprise too complete for anger yet. 14-gauge angiocath. Now. The respiratory therapist moved without hesitation. She recognized command when she heard it. Katie found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, felt the anatomical landmarks beneath her fingers like reading Braille. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. This was different from civilian code protocols, and she knew it. She was reaching deeper than nursing school, deeper than the 3 years she'd spent pretending to be just another civilian RN, deeper into the muscle memory of combat medicine under mortar fire. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping, that specific, terrible sound that meant the tension pneumothorax was decompressing, that meant oxygen was flowing back into the space that had been crushing the heart. "O2 sat," she asked. Climbing. 70. 75. 88. Sinus rhythm, the cardiac monitor announced in its electronic monotone. Captain Marcus Webb's heart found its rhythm. Found its way back from the flat line to the land of the living. His oxygen saturation climbed to 92% and held steady. Katie stepped back from the bed. Her left shoulder screamed, the old wound, the shrapnel damage, hated this kind of overhead work. She let out a single controlled breath. The room was silent except for the ventilator and the beeping of the monitors, all of them showing numbers that meant life instead of death. Dr. Caldwell's eyes were the color of winter. He wasn't looking at Captain Webb anymore. He was looking at Katie with the focused intensity of a man who understood that his entire architecture of control had just collapsed in under 90 seconds. "Step away from the patient," he said quietly. Katie turned to face him. She didn't speak. She'd learned that silence was louder than any justification. Her eyes were level with his, and in that moment, the entire ICU team was looking at her instead of at the doctor who'd called the code. That was the real injury he felt, not the loss of his authority, but the loss of the room's attention. One of the residents was already reaching for the phone. HR security. Incident reports. Katie could see the mechanical steps already unfolding like a cascade. The attending physician arrived 47 minutes later. Examined the patient. Reviewed the code sequence. His expression when he read the code notes was the expression of a man who understood that a crisis had been managed by someone who wasn't supposed to be there, using protocols that went beyond the scope of a bedside nurse. The HR director's voice on the phone was careful and professionally neutral. "We need you in conference room 3. Immediately. This is regarding a violation of a direct restriction order and an authorized performance of advanced procedures." Katie didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply walked downstairs and sat in a chair while the HR director read from a document that had clearly been prepared in advance, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. "You performed a needle decompression despite being explicitly prohibited from this patient's care. You interfered with a physician's management of a code. You practiced medicine without a license. These are grounds for immediate termination. Your badge is confiscated effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your belongings." The words washed over her without touching anything underneath. Katie had heard worse delivered with more cruelty. She'd heard orders that sent 19-year-olds into kill zones. She'd heard the sound of a husband taking his last breath. The badge came off her neck. Security walked her through the corridor, the same corridor where she'd run patients to MRI, where she'd held hands during the worst moments of people's lives, where she'd learned that civilian medicine was just as brutal as combat medicine, just slower. Staff members averted their eyes as she walked past. The nursing station went quiet. Not the silence of respect, the silence of distance, of people who understood that association was dangerous. She passed room for 12. Through the open doorway she could see Captain Webb's mother embracing his father, both of them crying, their shoulders shaking. The old man was pressing his wife's head against his chest. Their son had opened his eyes. Their son had come back from 2 years of darkness. Katie didn't stop. She didn't let them see her. Gratitude was a luxury that had to wait until she wasn't actively collapsing. The Seattle rain was the kind that fell sideways, driven by wind off the Pacific. Katie stood at David's grave as evening turned to dark, the marble so slick with water she could barely see the inscription. She pressed her forehead against it the way she used to press her forehead against a rifle stock, the cold stone the only thing keeping her anchored. "I found him," she whispered. The rain mixed with everything else, tears, sweat, the salt of her own biology. "I found our little Marcus. The boy we pulled out together before the second blast. And I'm failing him just like I failed you." Thunder rolled across San Diego like distant artillery. Her left shoulder throbbed where the shrapnel had gone in, where 2 years of physical therapy had rebuilt what a roadside bomb had destroyed. "You died getting him clear of the Humvee. I was dragging wounded out the other side when the pressure blast hit you. I couldn't save you. Now I can't protect him." Her voice broke like old glass. "He's alive but Caldwell will, I'm failing again." She stayed there until her knees were mud-soaked, her scrubs drenched, her body trembling not with fear but with the effort of holding everything together while everything came apart. The rain hammered the cemetery like applause for a show nobody had asked for. At home, the termination paperwork waited on her kitchen table, signed and official. Katie looked at it without reading it. She didn't tell anyone about the medical discharge from Walter Reed, the shrapnel that had torn through her left shoulder in Fallujah, the Distinguished Service Cross in a box she hadn't opened in 3 years. She didn't tell them about the 2 years learning to use her arm again, the physical therapy sessions where she'd cried into a towel so nobody would hear. She'd needed this civilian life to work. Past tense. Needed. The hospital security office ran the background check at 4:23 a.m., a routine administrative task in preparation for the termination file. The system froze. A red alert scrolled across the screen, a Department of Defense classified clearance flag tied to Katie's name, a notification protocol that security had never seen before. The security officer stared at it, then picked up the phone to a number that was printed in red ink on the instruction page. Captain Marcus Webb opened his eyes at 6:52 a.m. The first sensation was light, too bright, too white, coming at him through a thickness he couldn't name. The ventilator hissed its steady rhythm. His throat was wrong, invaded by the tube, his body a landscape of sensation that belonged to someone else. Then a face. A younger face. A woman in desert camouflage fatigues, her arms strong enough to carry him, moving through smoke and fire with the terrifying fluid grace of someone who'd learned her body's geometry the hard way. Her voice calling his name, telling him to close his eyes, telling him she wouldn't let go. 20 years ago. But real. Present. Alive in his muscle memory the way trauma was alive. His fingers twitched. The machines registered the movement. His eyes focused on the morning nurse's face, confused, then slid past her to the memory burning brighter than the lights. One word. One whispered sound that cost him everything in his damaged throat, his voice like gravel and time. Major. The attending nurse called for the attending physician. The attending physician called for administration. The hospital board assembled in emergency session at 8 a.m., still in shock, still processing the security flag, when the door opened and the HR director entered with a single file folder, her hands trembling as she read aloud. Major Katie Rodriguez. United States Army Medical Corps. 2 Silver Stars. Distinguished Service Cross. For combat deployments. 43 documented lives saved under fire. The silence was absolute. Measured. A silence that meant everything had just shifted on its axis. Then boots. Precise. Military cadence. A man in Navy dress uniform stood in the doorway, Commander James Mitchell, former SEAL team leader, his chest covered in medals, his bearing that particular quality of calm that comes from having survived things that shouldn't be survivable. I served 2 tours with Major Rodriguez, he said without preamble. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made everyone listen. I watched her perform a field thoracotomy with a combat knife while taking sniper fire, saving 3 Marines who are alive today because she understood the physics of survival better than she understood the limits of what was possible. He stepped fully into the room. She earned the Distinguished Service Cross pulling wounded from a burning Humvee in Ramadi. Seconds before it exploded. Her husband was killed in that explosion. She was medically discharged with severe shrapnel wounds. She rebuilt her life here, as a nurse, as someone trying to be part of healing instead of part of breaking. The CEO asked why she hid her service. Why she lied on her application. Because, Mitchell said, warriors don't always wear uniforms. And sometimes the bravest thing is starting over. Dr. Caldwell left the board meeting with his jaw clenched so tight his molars ached. They didn't know. Nobody in that room understood what they'd just done by allowing that clearance flag to surface, by letting the Admiral's voice fill the hospital through a speakerphone like some kind of divine judgment. He walked past the elevator bank and straight to his office, his hand shaking as he reached for his desk phone. The afternoon light slanted through his window, catching the edge of his medical school diploma on the wall. 23 years. 23 years of building this reputation, and now some army washout with a dislocated shoulder was about to burn it all down. He dialed the number he'd memorized from the local news station's website. His voice, when it came, was steady. Practiced. The kind of concerned authority that made people listen. By 5 o'clock, he was sitting in Studio B at KGTV Channel 10, makeup artist powder still settling on his forehead, a tie that cost more than most nurses made in a week cinched around his throat. The anchor across from him was blonde, sympathetic, nodding as he spoke about protocols and standards and the danger of letting emotion override medical judgment. What we're looking at here, Caldwell said, his hands folded on the desk with just the right amount of concern, is a woman who has infiltrated our institution using fabricated credentials. The studio lights were warm. Comforting. 5 million viewers across San Diego County watching him explain how he'd personally supervised her work, how he'd noticed inconsistencies immediately, how his only concern was patient safety. I don't take pleasure in this, he continued, and he almost believed it himself. But vigilantism, even wrapped in a uniform, puts people at risk. We have standards in medicine. We have codes. And when someone violates those codes, it's my responsibility as the chief attending to report it. The anchor leaned forward slightly. And you've documented all of this? Caldwell nodded. Complete incident reports. Filed with administration this morning. A lie wrapped in the kind of certainty that made people believe. He could see the anchor buying it, could see the camera operator adjusting his angle to catch Caldwell's noble profile. This was going to work. This was going to reframe the entire narrative before the federal investigation even started. Before anyone had time to examine his records more closely. Before anyone connected the dots between the missing dosages and his offshore account deposits. He was already calculating his next move, a statement from his attorney, perhaps a press conference with hospital administration backing him up. He'd been a doctor for 2 decades. He'd saved lives. One army nurse with delusions of grandeur wasn't going to change that. The studio phone rang. It wasn't a normal ring, it was the kind that made producers sit up in their chairs. The line producer's expression changed in the span of a heartbeat. She touched her earpiece, whispered something urgent to the floor manager. Then she was writing on a notepad with the kind of speed that suggested incoming news rather than routine scheduling. Caldwell kept his expression neutral, but something cold moved down his spine. The anchor's hand moved to his earpiece. His eyes shifted slightly. He glanced at a monitor Caldwell couldn't see. The producer handed him a note. The anchor read it, and Caldwell watched the precise moment when the man's professional persona shifted into something sharper. Something real. Dr. Caldwell, the anchor said, and his tone had changed in the space of 3 seconds, we have an incoming call. Admiral James Chen, commander of Naval Base San Diego. Admiral, you're live with us on KGTV Channel 10. The air in the studio went still. Caldwell's mouth went dry. The Admiral's voice filled the silence like a tidal wave, calm, precise, the kind of authority that came from commanding thousands of lives across for deployments. I'm calling, Admiral Chen said, to inform the citizens of San Diego County that Dr. Richard Caldwell is currently under federal investigation for systematic diversion of controlled substances over a period of 28 months. Caldwell's hands went numb. Using comatose patients as phantom recipients, the Admiral continued, his voice never wavering, Dr. Caldwell falsified pharmaceutical records to cover a total documented diversion of $47,000 in prescription opioids and benzodiazepines. This scheme was identified by Major Katie Rodriguez during routine chart reviews. The word major hung in the air like a rifle shot. Major Rodriguez, Admiral Chen continued, served 14 years with the United States Army Medical Corps, including for combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. She holds a Silver Star, a Purple Heart, and a Commendation Medal for valor in field medicine. Her observations of irregularities in Captain Marcus Webb's pharmaceutical record initiated a federal audit that revealed Dr. Caldwell's systematic diversion scheme. Caldwell tried to speak. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. On live television, in front of 5 million people, his carefully constructed reality was being dismantled sentence by sentence. Criminal charges will be filed within 48 hours, Admiral Chen said, including charges of theft of federal property, falsification of medical records, and abuse of a federal patient under military medical jurisdiction. The investigation is being conducted jointly by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service and the DEA. The anchor turned to Caldwell. His expression had shifted from sympathetic to stone. Dr. Caldwell, do you have a response? Caldwell's jaw worked. He looked at the camera. He looked at the anchor. He could feel every eye in the studio, every viewer in their living rooms, watching his face drain of color like someone had pulled a plug. He thought about his attorney. He thought about the offshore account. He thought about the passwords he'd written down in a personal journal that was probably already in federal custody. He reached up with trembling fingers, the trembling he'd never allowed Katie Rodriguez to see, the trembling that proved he was exactly what she'd always known he was, and he unclipped his microphone. The fabric made a soft ripping sound as he tore it from his shirt. He stood, his chair scraping backward. And he walked off set while the cameras rolled, while the red light stayed on, while every second of his exit was broadcast live to 5 million witnesses. The footage was viral within 17 minutes. By the time he reached his car in the parking garage, his phone had started ringing. His attorney. His wife. His attorney again. His wife again, this time her voice cracking with something that might have been rage or might have been the sound of a marriage dissolving in real time. He sat in his Mercedes, the one he'd bought with money that suddenly looked very much like the money they were going to ask about, and he understood with perfect clarity that his life, as he'd constructed it, was finished. Not damaged. Not threatened. Finished. The next morning came too quickly. Federal agents arrived at Seattle General at 7 a.m., which was technically the beginning of his shift, which meant his staff got to watch him walk out of the hospital in handcuffs. They got to see the perp walk, the silver bracelets, the agent's hand on top of his head as he lowered himself into the back of a dark sedan. They got to photograph it, video it, text it to other hospitals in the network. By noon, the medical board had suspended his license pending investigation. By 2 p.m., his attorney was negotiating a deal to avoid federal prison time in exchange for permanent license revocation and full cooperation with the investigation. By 5 p.m., Dr. Richard Caldwell's medical career was officially over. It had taken exactly 37 hours. 6 months later, Katie Rodriguez walked through the lobby of Seattle General wearing a hospital badge that read something different now. Katie Rodriguez, Major, retired. ICU Director. The badge felt heavier than it had any right to, but her shoulders were strong enough to carry it. She passed the security desk on the way to the elevator. He was there. Caldwell. Night shift, which meant he worked when nobody important was watching, in a polyester uniform that bore no insignia, checking visitor logs with a pen that looked like it cost $3 at a drugstore. Their eyes met for exactly the fraction of a second it took Katie to pass. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them had anything left to say. Katie took the elevator to the 4th floor, the one that didn't exist when Caldwell was in power, the one she'd rebuilt piece by piece with protocols that required 2 nurses per critical patient, with mandatory double checks on all controlled substance dosages, with documentation so thorough that it would take a team of auditors 6 months to trace every single milligram. In room for 12, Captain Marcus Webb sat upright in bed. His legs were stronger now. His voice was clear. Physical therapy had worked exactly the way it was supposed to work when someone actually had a chance to wake up and heal instead of being used as a ghost in a pharmaceutical shell game. His elderly parents were there, his mother knitting something complicated in blue yarn, his father reading the newspaper with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was still processing the fact that his son was awake. The faded unit patch from the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines was framed on the wall. It hung beside a photograph that made Katie's throat tight every single time she saw it, a young major in dusty fatigues carrying a 9-year-old boy from smoke and flames, both their faces streaked with ash. Webb's face, unmarked and shocked, caught mid-rescue. Katie's face, turned away from the camera, her left shoulder already burning with shrapnel wounds that would ache for the rest of her life. "Morning, Major," Webb said when she entered. His smile was genuine. The smile of someone who'd come back from the edge of nothing and found his life waiting on the other side. Katie checked his chart, made notes, adjusted his for line with the kind of efficiency that came from having done this 10,000 times before. His father stood up. Extended his hand. "My son told us everything," he said. His voice had the weight of gratitude that didn't know how to fit into words. "About Ramadi. About you and your husband. We can never," Katie shook her head gently. "Not unkind. Just clear. You don't leave your people behind," she said. "Not then. Not now." She finished with Webb's chart and turned to leave. His voice followed her to the doorway. "Major? David would be proud." Katie paused. Her left shoulder ached the way it always did before rain. Outside the windows, helicopters passed toward Naval Base San Diego, their rotors beating the air like a second heartbeat. She allowed herself the smallest smile. In the hallway, the new nursing class was doing their rounds. Their instructor, a woman named Chen who had no relation to the Admiral but carried the name like a good omen anyway, gestured toward Katie as the students passed. "That's Major Rodriguez," Chen said, and her voice carried the kind of respect that didn't come from fancy diplomas or award ceremonies. It came from knowing what someone had survived and how they'd chosen to come back. Remember her story. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Sometimes they've bled for this country and come back to bleed for it again, a drop at a time, saving lives in places you'll never know about. That's real heroism. That's what we're training for. That's what it actually means. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and reliable. Katie walked to the next patient room without breaking stride. Outside, the San Diego afternoon was turning into something that might bring rain. She didn't flinch anymore. She had her life back. She had her purpose. She had Captain Webb, awake and healing, his father's gratitude sitting on her shoulders like a weight she could finally bear without breaking. Dr. Caldwell worked nights in a security uniform. That was enough. That was justice written in a way she could live with. If you or someone you know has witnessed suspicious pharmaceutical practices or staff misconduct in a healthcare setting, there are ways to report it safely. The Veterans Affairs Administration maintains a hotline at 800-555-VETERANS. NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, can be contacted through your nearest military installation. The DEA and your state medical board both accept anonymous reports through their official websites. The Joint Commission, which accredits hospitals nationwide, investigates patient safety concerns at 1-800-994-3996. You don't have to be military to report. You don't have to have credentials. You just have to have noticed something wrong. That's where it starts. That's always where it starts. Like and subscribe if you love stories about people who've been underestimated. Comment below if you've ever had someone doubt you and you proved them wrong. Let's get back to it.